Hi, it's Keith from the Evangelical Free Church, Stony Stratford, and we're continuing our series of short talks in the Gospel of Luke. And today we come to Luke chapter 12, verses 49 to 53. Jesus has been talking about being ready when he comes again, but now we get a major change of tone. Many years ago, when I turned 40, the day started like any other, except we were on holiday on the Isle of Mallorca in a place called Porta Pollenza. But suddenly there was a knock on the door and someone delivered champagne to our room. Now that took me back a bit. Tracy's always been wonderful in getting me presents and being a wonderfully loving wife and surprising me with nice things she buys for my birthday. But that was a bit of a surprise. To me, it was slightly out of character for Tracy, but nevertheless, it was very much appreciated. Now, when we come to this passage, we get a bit of a surprise. It doesn't quite fit what we sometimes think of Jesus's character. This is not gentle Jesus, meek and mild. Just listen to the start of the passage in verse 49. I have come to bring fire on the earth, and how I wish it was already kindled. That sounds a bit sort of aggressive, scary. Like I said, it doesn't sound like gentle Jesus, does it? So he's saying something we just do not expect. Very, very radical and somewhat disturbing. But it's actually linked to his death, verse 50. But I have a baptism to undergo, and how distressed I am until it is completed. Here's the link. This is what it's about. Jesus has come, and it's not just that Jesus is some good man, an itinerant preacher, particularly gifted, wandering around with a few good ideas. There's a battle going on here. Jesus comes to liberate us from Satan, the devil's rule. That is going to be won on the cross. And yeah, the whole thought of that is distressing to Jesus. We've been thinking recently at Easter, Jesus was cut off from his Father. He took the punishment upon himself that we deserved. It's literally like having his Father, who loved him dearly, and vice versa, turn his back on him. There was spiritual and physical pain involved. And that's the cost. But it also goes on. Jesus says that this message, although that's a good message, the thought of being reconciled with a holy God when we're sinful people is the best news in the world. It saves us from being judged by him, doesn't it? But Jesus says this, not everyone treats it as good news. Verse 51, do you think I came to bring peace on the earth? No, I tell you, but division. From now on, there will be 5 in one family divided against each other, 3 against 2, and 2 against 3. They will be divided, father against son, son against father, mother against daughter, and daughter against mother, mother-in-law against daughter-in-law, and daughter-in-law against mother-in-law. Sometimes the gospel brings real division. Some years ago, I remember my pastor, Wallace, telling me that when he was working with the youth up in Cheadle, where he was vicar, they had a lot of youth come into the church who really were discovering the gospel for the first time. And they'd had the usual disputes that they would have with their parents. They would say, why can't I stay out late? Why can't I sleep with my boyfriend or girlfriend? And the parents would say something like this, you just can't. Now, when they came in and heard the good news of the gospel at the church, and were converted, they were going back to their parents and saying, now we understand why we shouldn't sleep with our girlfriend and boyfriend, because God forbids it. God forbids it for our own good, so we can cherish that relationship in marriage. Wallace said, do you think it brought harmony? No, it brought some real problems with the parents. Sometimes the gospel brings division because some people will just be so anti it. Think about it. It is humbling, isn't it, to admit that we're wrong? It's humbling to admit that we need help. But let's look at it this way. In the letter to the Corinthian church, the Apostle Paul is writing to people, and they live in quite a hostile environment. It's quite interesting what he has to say here. And he talks about the difference between Jews and Greeks. And he says this, verse 22 of chapter 1 of 1 Corinthians, Jews demand miraculous signs and Greeks look for wisdom. But we preach Christ crucified, a stumbling block to Jews and foolishness to the Gentiles. But to those whom God has called, both Jews and Greeks, Christ, the power of God and the wisdom of God. You see what I mean? It's good news, but it divides people. People will say, perhaps that's not intellectual enough for us, or that's not extraordinary enough for us. But the gospel in its purest form, in the form Jesus teaches it, saves. Thank you so much for listening.